This is part 2 of the roster review. Part 1 covered my 6 gold earning characters. Part 2 is everything else that I've geared up to getting a relic set, probably like a 4x3 or above, which includes 4 former gold characters. There's a lot of characters to cover, so let's just get into it. Starting off with the Paladin. Like any sane person, it is a support Paladin. He's running the same build I built him with when Vaulton was the current endgame. There was no immediate need to upgrade it, and I just ran it until Artist came out. And then I didn't want to rebuild it because I wasn't sure if I was going to keep it or swap it for Artist. So the Paladin experience is a pretty easy one. By far the easiest support and easiest class to play, which can be a really good thing, but it also means you could get really bored of it over time, and a lot quicker than you would with other classes. Compared to the other 2 supports, Paladin doesn't really have to worry about that much about placement or positioning. They only really need to target 2 skills, which is their marking skill and their DR. An example being that all supports have 2 damage buffs. This allows them to have uptime between the 2 buffs. Bard and Artist have one 24-meter coverage one, and the one that is a small area that they place on the ground. Paladin just has 2 different 24-meter ones. They don't have to target or aim anything. And the same thing applies to their shield. It's just one thing that they hit. Now, one difference is that they only have the 1 shield. The good thing is that 1 shield can do a small heal at the end. And on top of that, it can also cleanse. So it's really good at topping people off who don't take that much damage. And probably one of the other greatest things about a Paladin is that its support buff, with its meter, its specialty gauge, you don't have to make the choice between healing or a damage buff. It's both built into one. Yes, it's not going to be as powerful as, say, a Bard's healing or buff, but you don't have to make a choice. You just pop it and go, which it's just one big AoE around you. And then another great thing about Paladin is built-in defense. This makes running heavy armor an option, but not mandatory, as opposed to Bard and Artist. So while Bard and Artist have the option to basically run Drops of Ether or Vital Hit Point, Paladin can easily run both because they don't need to use a slot for heavy armor. And then since I did talk about the kit for Bard and Artist, I want to say that Paladin's kit is just universally good. The community guide bread and butter build, that's basically the build that everybody uses. There's very little need to switch outside of it. You run 2 counters generally, and on top of that, you really only use like 11 tripods in that build. So when it comes to things I don't like, well, like I said, it can be a con that the class is so easy because then it gets really boring. But the most infuriating thing about it is the fact that if you whiff your ult, if you don't hit anything with it, you don't get the meter for it. I do think it's a risk versus reward design, as you get about 75% of your meter if you do hit it, compared to a Bard which only gets 1 of the 3 meters, so 33%, and then an Artist gets 2 bubbles, which is 66%. So ultimately this character was dropped because it just wasn't as fun, and I just didn't like the ult as much. Moving on to Scrapper, I started off tight and I switched to Shock around Brel. Wanted to experience a spec class with a higher damage ceiling. Starting off with Tie Scrapper, it was generally a good time. It was a fun class. It was very comfortable because I built it with Half Swiftness. Along with that, it had 2 movement skills, so it was really good at back attack chasing while not being frustrating. Now, the main downside with it was one of the main downsides I had with Shock as well, which is some of the animations are pretty long and it takes a while for them to be active. Examples of these moves that just take a long time is going to be Supernova, Death Rattle, and Battering Fist, along with Chain Destruction Fist and Potent Rising Fist, 3 of those being pretty Shock exclusive. So when you play Shock, you're full spec, you don't really have that good of a movement skill on it, and you're back attack chasing with long animations. This made Shock feel like a very acquired taste. Another factor I want to bring up is my static only has 1 Deathblade and no Gun Lancers in their rosters. So I never really had the proper synergies to make my Scrapper shine. So overall, my Scrapper experience was pretty mid. I liked Tie over Shock, but at the same time, I knew the potential Slayer had, and Slayer was coming, and there was no reason to rebuild back into Tie when I could just make a Slayer. Scrapper and Slayer both exist. It really just feels like, why would I ever play Scrapper? You got Stubby Range. Slayer has a gigantic sword and also movement speed on both builds. And of course, it just shits out damage. But also, I like swords over fisting things, so Shadowhunter was the OG main. Started off as DI. Around Brel Heart, I actually switched to Perfect Depression. This was back when DI books were like 15k. So I figured let's try Perfect Suppression, so I could do the entire build for less than it would cost me in the books. But let's get DI out of the way first. So pretty much a lot of the things I had to say about Scouter still applies to Shadowhunter. It's a 2-gem Andy comfortable class. You can take a decent amount of damage with it. When you transform, you get a heal. Unlike Scouter, don't chain your attacks, which is something I actually didn't talk about with Scouter. But yeah, one of the biggest prices for Shadowhunter is that his counter is not one of its damage skills. Yes, you still use it, but it has a very short cooldown, and you're actually likely to counter with it because it's going to be off cooldown more than it isn't. Even outside of transformation, it has a really good counter. The active frames on that thing is eternity. The skills you use to build your meter are more forgiving, they're more instant, just overall easier to use than Scouter. Now, just like Evo Scouter, the damage ceiling is going to be lower, so now on to Perfect Suppression. So at the time of this video, you do kind of have to make this a back attack class. In the upcoming update, we will be able to play it as Hitmaster type class all around, which actually looks interesting to me because I can actually use spinning weapon. But the good news is that you can use a good amount of swiftness on this class. You can even go full swift if you want. So back attack chasing isn't that bad. Now the downside is the more swiftness you have, you're gonna need some additional mana regen. May it be food or regen on your bracelet. Play full crit, you probably won't need it, but you're gonna be pretty slow. But you do have a good movement skill, and again, in the upcoming update, you're actually gonna be able to go through enemies with it. Even though its damage ceiling is higher than DI, it's not huge. You do really get to appreciate those moments where you don't waste meter because of transformation time and then like a mechanic. Both have good stagger destruction, and PS does bring also that really good counter, or at least you can bring that one. And even if you don't run Rising Claw, the other one is still pretty good too. Collision is a bit of a longer animation, but overall, given all the memes about Perfect Suppression, I expected the character to be a lot worse than it actually is. I think it's actually pretty fun. I do wish it did more damage because again, kind of like the same situation of Scrapper, it just feels obsolete when comparing to something like Slayer. Moving on to Summoner. Now I play Master Summoner. It's a 4x3 build. Unlike the other three so far, this one was never in the roster. This was never a gold earner. To this day, I still think Summoner is one of the best classes in the game. Great damage, great destruction, great stagger. I still see it as a better Sorc as it has the damage of a Sorc, but you can also bring a counter. Most Igniter Sorcs don't take it. It is a very powerful and versatile class. I would say the only major downside, the only thing that really deterred me, the only thing that I didn't have fun with when I played it, is that there is cast time, there is animation lock, so there is a potential to really whiff some of your major skills like dropping the spears or something moving out of the way of your Kier, because that is a pretty long cast time for the damage to go out. Now I really did want to like Reaper. I planned for this character to go into my roster, but I never really had that fun moment with it. Now I played Hunger, and it was in the clown era that I decided that this character just wasn't for me. It was just a character I was gonna bench. Now what I liked about it is that you had skills that you can go through the boss. You have 2 of them. So it was a good back attack chasing class. And on top of that, your counter you could hit from back or front, because it was one of those teleporting skills that go from back to front or front to back or side to side. Goes through the enemy. And nothing else on the kit was really that flashy or cool that really made me want to keep playing it. Consider trying Thirst, but it's still a lot of the same. And also keeping up your hunger stacks was pretty annoying. You can kind of think of it as an ADR that you have to keep up even during downtime, even during cutscenes, because you do have some of your purple skills that you can use and whiff, and you would still keep your stack up. So it just felt really annoying to just kind of keep on using those things during mechanics, during stings where you have to position yourself. So it just turned out to be a not fun class for me. And also those skills that can pass through, they can lead to some pretty bad times. One accidental hit could get you knocked off in Vault or Brill. Now Wardancer, this one's kind of tough to tackle. Now at the time of making this video, I am playing a 3-spender hallucination ESO. I did spend some time as First Intention, but I think since this class has so many different build varieties and things to talk about it, I'm just going to talk about this class as a whole as opposed to talking about specs, because that entire topic, that's the topic of the class as a whole, is one of the most interesting parts about Wardancer. There are so many different ways to play this class. You could play a First Intention back attack, you could play a First Intention any position, and then when it comes to ESO, you can play 2-spender, 3-spender, 4-spender, and then you can also play any one of those as back or front attack. So this is a class that basically has 8 or so acceptable builds. So with your build variety, you can choose how much damage you really want to aim for and how much comfort you want to go with it. I picked 3-spender hallucination, which means I don't have to worry about back attack. I have some swiftness, so I can kind of freely move around better, and with the help of that swiftness, I get pretty high uptime on my party buffs. And because you have such a variety with how you want to play the class, you do have some pretty good varieties when it comes to engravings as well. Because you have so much options, so much versatility, it's really hard to say anything negative about this class. Like the closest thing I got is that if you play First Intention, you know, you are basically a buff bot. Your damage does exist, kind of, I guess. This is a character in class that had I made it earlier, I probably would have had it in my roster and might still be in. I guess on the flip side, if you do play the 4-spender ESO and trophy, you're very selfish because you can't just buff on cooldown, but at least you should be doing huge damage. Now, Lancemaster, Glavier, whatever. This is also a former gold earner. I dropped this character a little bit before Clown, and I never considered playing Control, only Pinnacle. One thing I really loved is the lack of downtime with this class. Despite being a spec-based class, since you had the 2 stances, which had 2 different pages of skills, you always had something to do. On top of that, these skills were very versatile. She could actually function pretty well at a mid-range. If you had to stay out from mechanics, she still had something you could do. On top of that, she has the parry skill, which I still don't think any other class has like this. I liked it for the fact that you could avoid damage while also doing damage, but it wasn't ever really good damage, kind of filler. Like the overall concept of the skill and the usage is good, which allows me to segue into what I didn't like. I like the overall concept of this class, but when I actually played it, there were still some things to be desired. First of all, filling out the full meter to do your transitions from stance to stance was pretty annoying, because if you get left out into it, you're really slow and really screwed up for a while, which I was already dealing with that enough on Shadowhunter and then Scouter. So that was a big factor of I've had enough of doing this. I don't want to do this on another character. Because you do get buffs when you transition when you have a full bar. Now, since I mentioned this with other classes, I'm going to mention with Glavier as well. In the latest KR balance patch, Glavier got shot up to the moon. Like, it is a super juice class. Pinnacle is on par with Slayer. And more importantly to me, you can transition stance to stance with one segment of the bar instead of having the entire bar full. So class is extremely more fluid, but it also does change to in trophy back attack and a burst over consistent. Sorc was once a roster character and I dropped it before Vicus hard. It was an instant cast reflux and I just didn't have any fun with it. This isn't a character I'd ever bring back. It's like, yes, I could try Igniter, but I'd rather just play Master Summoner. The Deadeye I don't really have set up. His Slayer accessories just don't really exist on the market. The ones that do are extremely overpriced. This character just completely exists because I'm looking forward to the buffs, the changes, and the new skill. But I don't have too many opinions formed on it. I think it's just kind of an alright class so far. I mean, you do play close to mid-range and kind of squishy, so that's a downside. And then finally, DB, Arti, and Soulfist are characters that got benched because I just couldn't afford them. I still can't afford extra characters, and it might be something I do down the line. So that wraps it up. That's my thoughts on all my characters so far. Me being someone who loves a lot of action games, I like high speed and I like high movement. With Aeromancer and Soul Eater on the way, I'm going to be on a roster crisis once again. I know Gunslinger's on its way out and I might have to drop a support. We'll see. It depends on if we still have too many supports in our static. That's it for this video. I spent way too long talking about Paladin and I'll catch you next time.